We want the chance to develop programs that would help solve the problems of today and prepare a future for our children.
The Yukon was a very different place in the early 1970s. There was a large gap between the haves and have-nots. And for Yukon First Nations, they were tired of being poor, deprived, and they wanted to get a land claim settled.
The courts have defined these rights to hunt fish.
Dave Joe has been in the front lines of self-government and land claims. He is a citizen of the Champlain and Ajax First Nations and was the Yukon's first Indigenous lawyer. He was also the former chief negotiator of the Council of First Nations. In 2008, Joe was named the Officer of the Order of Canada. Joe says Yukon First Nations were forbidden to raise issues of a land claims agreement starting in 1927.
We didn't have any rights prior to 1951. We didn't get the right to vote till 1960 with the Bill of Rights that was put in place.
You all of a sudden get the Alaska highways being improved. Whitehorse starts to grow quite dramatically. You get the Faro is developed in the late 1960s, right? Clinton Creek is developed at the same time. Cassiar down south of Watson Lake. You got mining construction, mining development happening all around. Whitehorse copper is going up. And you can see the Yukon First Nations basically saying, if we don't get some measure of control, we will have no ability to determine our own destiny.
Probably what we've got in the territory is about 90% of the white communities have water and sewer service, and probably 90% of the Indian communities don't have water and sewer service.
Yukon First Nations were tired of being under the control of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. First Nations had very little control over their lives. Tlingit elder Sam Johnson was one of the chiefs who went to Ottawa in 1973. He grew up in Teslin.
When I first became a chief, there was nothing there. And so we're trying to get things organized, and then in the back of my mind I was thinking, should trying to keep some kind of record of what you're doing. But we didn't even have paper, would you believe? No pencils.
In 1973, the Yukon Native Brotherhood and the Yukon Association of Non-Status Indians joined to form the Council for Yukon Indians.
The Yukon Indian chiefs sum up their position in one sentence which reads, "Many of our people feel that our grievances are so great that there is no way we can be compensated for what has happened to us." Having said that, Chief Elijah Smith of the Native Brotherhood doesn't bother about legal or Aboriginal rights. Rather, he works from the assumption that Ottawa has a political and moral obligation to make a deal with the Yukon Indians, who have never signed treaties like their brothers in southern Canada. The Indians say it will take more than cash to solve their problems. They want to participate in the development of their land. In their words, "We will not sell our heritage for a quick buck or a temporary job."
The late Elijah Smith was the chief of the Kwalin Dun at the time and a political activist. He wanted a better future for Yukon's First Nations.
That's where my dad and I used to have a cabin there. Then we used to go from there when we were hunting foxes. Go on top of those mountains, all them mountains you see across there. And today you got nothing. We got nothing. All our land taken away. Fences built across our trails. So that was the reason that I started this land claim.
In 1973, Smith and a group of 12 First Nation chiefs traveled to Ottawa. Smith carried a document entitled "Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow." The booklet was a grassroots document that became the basis for negotiating Yukon First Nation land claims.
We are here with a plan that will cost the Canadian taxpayer much less than if the present government policies and program continue.
This approach which you have taken in here is one, therefore, which is very welcome to the government. We think that it is a much more fruitful way of solving the problems than trying to rewrite history and what should have been done and what might have been done a few centuries ago by people who have long since been buried.
Ken Coates says Pierre Trudeau made the decision to accept the Yukon land claim, not because it was the right thing to do, but because the government came close to losing the Nisga'a decision, a legal battle that was unfolding in the early 1970s.
The Calder case went to the Supreme Court. They basically said that the Nisga'a had the right to the land, that they were the traditional owners of the land, and the actual final decision was 3-3 to 1. And when you have a tie in the Supreme Court, it goes to the government, right? So Trudeau opposed the idea of modern treaties. Pierre Trudeau opposed the idea of modern treaties completely.
Coates says if the government lost the Nisga's case, then modern treaties would be the rule of the country, which the Liberal government at the time didn't want.
You would have had to follow what the court said. And if that had happened, the government would have lost control. So what happened, the Liberal government at that time, 1973, says, we got to be careful here. We just about lost this case. If there's another case like it and we lose it, we're not going to control the future in terms of land claim settlements. We won't be able to control the shape. The Supreme Court will tell us. Yukon land claim came along at exactly the right time and said, okay, you want to negotiate land claims, here's the best one for you.
While the case was lost, the Supreme Court of Canada ruling recognized for the first time that Aboriginal title has a place in Canadian law.
You know, there was a lot of work to get the people to understand what is it that we're trying to do. But the Prime Minister was against this whole thing. He didn't think there was no Aboriginal rights in the Yukon or any place in Canada.
The meeting with Yukon chiefs was historic. Prime Minister Trudeau committed to begin negotiating with Yukon First Nations.
They gave us the right to regain our way, to govern our way, to teach our children our way.
Elijah's son Steve Smith says his dad would travel to all the communities to find out what First Nations wanted in a treaty.
He had a 30,000 foot view, and he had a long-term visionary idea of where he was thinking our people needed to go and to get back to regain our dignity and regain our place within society's fabric, especially in the Yukon, where we were continually marginalized every week and every day and every month, and we were continued to be marginalized to the edges of society.
Judy Dingell was the only woman who was part of the delegation in 1973. She says Smith was the right leader to represent Yukon First Nations.
It really surprised us, but I've always looked back, how important it is for leaders of the day to bring forth the message and not to give up, and to make sure that they carry out the directions of the chiefs of the day. And I have to say, Elijah Smith did that well. He was a very likable person. We had good people working with us. We had consultants around us that really helped us, especially with the Liberal government.
Percy Henry was chief of the Trondac-Huachen First Nation in 73. He thought that the meeting with the Prime Minister was a done deal.
How long you think that you finish, he said. And Dave Joe wanted the lawyers just begin there. Oh, it's about 6 months. That was 25 years ago.
Who had the experience of doing a treaty, right? The olden treaties, the numbered treaties. Canada would arrive in the morning and the treaty would be done by about 3 or 4 o'clock. And treaty payments were made. And we estimated if they took like a day to work out an old treaty, a numbered treaty, like treaty number 11, we thought makes sense that 6 months is a very long time period.
But that 6-month expectation would take another 20 years of negotiating. During the next several years, both parties went to work to get land claims settled, until the Liberal government made a lowball offer.
They dictated a claim on March 3rd, 1975, in which they made an offer of, as I recall, about $75 million in 100 square miles per Indian band for 1,200 square miles. And that was pretty much their offer.
And at the time, they were offering what people thought was a lot of money. Remember that Yukon First Nations people, say in the Whitehorse area, had tiny little reserves, in the worst possible place. I mean, they were north of the industrial park, right next to the mosquito swamp. This is not where anybody would want to sort of build a house, right? It was not a very nice, it wasn't a traditional sort of habitation sort of area. So when the government came forward with their idea, people were going, whoa, this is a lot of money, and this is a lot of land and all that sort of stuff. By 1976, the Yukon First Nation had turned it down flat.
The original 84 agreement in principle had a lot more money, a lot more land.
In 1984, the federal government and the Council for Yukon Indians reached an agreement in principle.
This is an historic agreement. This will be a model. From my perspective, I hope it is, for the whole country, because it breaks so much new ground. Here, for the first time, the Indian leadership themselves negotiate a role within a unified government system. Now, already indicated, I give full marks to the YTG for that, too. The other major thing they've done is they've made no distinction between Indians, between natives. No status, non-status, all that. All of them are together and treated equally for the benefits of this entire agreement.
The fact that we've actually signed an agreement is the most significant thing. We've come, over 10, 11 years, we've come to this stage a couple of times before and we've refused to sign. And this is the first time that we've made a decision to go with it.
For all the things that the federal government and the YTG agreed to do under this agreement in principle, in exchange for that, the money, the hunting, the fishing, the land selections, the whole surface, subsurface, the whole package, which is very complex, we're asking the CYI and the Indian people here to, in exchange for that, to give up any further claims that they may have based on Aboriginal rights.
4 First Nations were against the agreement because Aboriginal rights would be extinguished. Dave Joe said this was the federal government's all-or-nothing offer.
All of the legal rights that you've got as a First Nation person would be extinguished in exchange for the contractual rights within the treaty. And that extinguishment clause was contained in all of the modern treaties to date, with the James Bay Cree, with the Inuvialuit in 1984, and reflected in their offer back then. And the Yukon First Nation said, no, we want to hang on to our title, and we wanted to crystallize our title under the guise of a treaty agreement. And so that was essentially the clause that killed the deal back then.
8 First Nation bands were ready to sign. Some chiefs felt the federal government was pressuring them into a take-it-or-leave-it deal. The late Chief Robert Hager with the Nacho-Onak Den First Nation in Mayo didn't like the agreement in principle and voted against it.
My biggest question next is I think we have to take the matter to court case. And I believe that all the matter have to be ratified by the Indian people. They pretty well have to understand of the land claim and all things. If they don't understand it, and then there have to be court case till we really truly understand it.
It is not breaking away. It's carrying out the duties that were handed to us as board of directors and as chiefs. All we are doing is just carrying out what we were told to do.
Some chiefs felt the federal government was pressuring them into a take-it-or-leave-it deal. During this time, a federal election was looming and the Liberal government wanted to get the deal signed. But that never happened. In September of 1984, a new Conservative government was elected. David Crombie was the new Indian and Northern Affairs Minister. He said he could negotiate 3 of the 6 areas in the agreement in principle: extinguishment of Aboriginal rights, subsistence hunting, and land selection.
There's been no change in any substance, either from the federal government's point of view or indeed from anyone else's point of view yet, because what we were talking about primarily is the question of process.
But the final 3 relating to First Nations self-government were not on the table for the Conservatives. The Yukon government also weighed in and said any agreement should be final. The Yukon government would not sign the agreement unless it included the extinguishment clause.
The 6 items that the CYI we're looking for to open negotiations are primarily items that deal directly with the government of Canada. The ones that affect us so dramatically that they would have the result of throwing out some of the agreements in principle that are in place now that we don't want to see thrown out.
Over the next year, the Council for Yukon Indians ran out of negotiating money, forcing them to lay off all but 17 staff members.
I made a clear understanding to everyone that the funding would reflect the process.
It's not a good deal. When you're dealing with a government people who's got all the cards, you don't make a good deal. But that's the best we could do.
Dave Joe says it was tough walking away from $620 million, but the overall plan was never about a big cash buyout.
The strategy amongst us was to sort of back-end load the treaty, both in terms of constitutional power and in terms of cash, so that we didn't take very much power up front, very much cash up front, etc. Instead, we would leave it to succeeding generations.
The next few years of negotiations dragged on, with 4 First Nation bands wanting a new agreement, while the other 8 bands wanted to go ahead with the '84 agreement. Some First Nations were also tired of 17 years of land claims going nowhere.
Lots of our old people that have heard of, oh, there's land claims. I see them walking around. There's going to be land claims pretty soon. Some people are all being put down in the ground long time ago with nothing. Not even 2 red pennies to rub together. Not that they died from it, but they expected it. They expected it all the time, and nothing happened.
There was a lot of racism towards First Nations during this time period as well, especially with Yukon First Nation's idea of self-government.
It was, if you sign these agreements, we'll never get a mine built in the Yukon again. If you sign these agreements, the First Nations will stop all development. We can't build a road. We can't do this. We can't do that. And the Yukon will never flourish. We'll never have a chance. And what happened as the negotiations went on and the word started to get about how much money they were talking about. Not $1 million, not $5 million, but hundreds of millions of dollars. And long-term transfers and self-government agreements. The business community in the Yukon sort of said, in general, this actually could be the biggest infusion of capital into the Yukon in our history. Outside the Klondike Gold Rush was capital flowing out. It wasn't capital really coming in. And so they actually went from sort of real opposition in 1973 to silent opposition in the 1970s and 1980s. Time you get to the 1990s, it's like, hey, this is a good deal. This could be the thing that pushes the Yukon to the next level.
Very pleased at this time to make the announcement that we've received confirmation from Ottawa that Cabinet has met on the Yukon Framework Agreement and they have approved it. We now have the commitments we need to finish the land claims in the Yukon.
An agreement in principle was reached in 1989 with the federal government after 16 years of negotiations.
Well, the number one thing, of course, is to really organize the CYI. First of all, to do the umbrella final agreement, and secondly, to see how CYI will provide the resources that are required in the communities.
For some non-Aboriginal people, the UFA caught them off guard. Various groups, including the Chamber of Mines and the Yukon Fish and Game Association, wanted public meetings to find out more about the deal because they were getting cold feet.
They got the native people asking for certain things, the white people want to know what they're going to lose and what they want. We're all confused, the whole bloody works of us.
I know you're still negotiating, but you won't tell us even specifics of what you're negotiating.
And you're going to have to answer to 20,000 non-beneficiaries of the agreement in principle. Why don't you get them involved now?
We are. That's why we're here. You simply can't negotiate in public. I mean, believe me, trust me, you can't negotiate things as sensitive as this in public. You see, we're negotiators. We're not politicians. We can't promise things.
You're carrying out these negotiations in secret.
I want to know what you mean by respecting third-party interests. I believe that most people here want protected interests. Here, here.
If you people was that interested in 1969, why didn't you join me when I was asking for help? Now, when we're sitting at the table just about ready to finish, now you come in and start complaining. I came out in the public one time saying, we're not bothering no white people. Wherever their homes are, whatever land they took is theirs. We're bothering the government. But once we get our John Henry on the paper there and start talking, we'll talk business with you people. Where else are we going to go to find partners?
Elijah's son, Steve Smith, says when his dad spoke, people listened. He says Elijah was unbiased towards non-First Nation people.
You know, because he fought in the Second World War and he was an equal, right? Men, for the most part, were living and dying. There was no prejudicial bullet coming across the field at you, right? It killed indiscriminately.
The Umbrella Final Agreement, dated November the 23rd, 1991, is hereby approved as the basis for completing the negotiations of final agreements which reflect the particular circumstances of the First Nations. Anyone opposed? I see no one opposed. I declare resolution number 12 carried by consensus.
Elijah Smith was almost able to see his dream come true, Canada's first self-government land claims agreement. But sadly, he died in October 1991, 2 years before the UFA signing ceremony.
I'd like to welcome you today to a very important day for the original people of the Yukon, as well as for all people of the Yukon Territory. Today marks a very significant time. It'll be a signing ceremony that'll mark the passage of the Umbrella Final Agreement and 4 First Nation final and self-government agreements.
Once the agreement was signed in May of 1993, some almost 20 years after, it was a huge accomplishment to bring in all of the Yukon First Nations, those that accepted the proposal, to basically have a common front under the UFA, which was the common agreement, and also for the first 4 to have achieved their own unique components. I mean, it was a relief to having achieved all of those successes and to change the policy of Canada in a national context. That was huge.
It's been a long time. We're going to do great things because we now have the opportunity to do it ourselves, to do it our way, and to make our own mistakes.
One thing Paul forgot to say when he signed that agreement is, hello self-government, goodbye Indian affairs.
The world is paying attention because this agreement, started with Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, is one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable, assertion of Indigenous rights in the history of the world. And the world is paying way more attention to Yukon than would ever imagine. No other place in Canada gets even close to the amount of attention as the Yukon does for the things it's doing because of this agreement, because it is truly an international trendsetter.
Under the UFA agreement, Yukon First Nations divided $243 million and retained title to 8.6% of the Yukon, and had a greater say in the environment, resources, and wildlife. By 1998, 3 more First Nations signed their agreements. Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, Selkirk First Nation, the Trondac-Quetchen First Nation, all became self-governing First Nations.
Feels great. I tell you, it's a long time coming.
In 2002, the Ta'an Kwachun Council signed its agreements.
John Chair John Rudyk and their legal counsel that will complete the signing. Ladies and gentlemen, signing is completed. Let's give him a big hand.
And in 2003, the Klawani First Nation signed. In 2005, the Carcrass Tagish First Nations signed their agreements. Kwanlin Dun Chief Doris Bill says the agreements have strengthened her community and stand the test of time.
I think that they're the strongest agreements in the country, and many people have said so, and I don't know if they will ever negotiate another agreement similar to ours.
Today is a historic day for all of us, especially for the Kwanlin Dun people. Our journey to reach this agreement we are signing today has been long and difficult. 30 years for some of us is a long time, but in terms of our people in this land, it's only a blink of an eye.
The Kwanlin Dun First Nation signed their agreement in 2005. Since then, the First Nation has become the largest private landowner in Whitehorse.
Kwanlin Dun is really at the forefront of a lot of things, you know, of community justice, community safety, you know, land-based healing. There's so much that our First Nation can be proud of, you know. But these things didn't start under me. They started a long time ago, and I think, you know, you talked about Chief Mike Smith, and he had those visions as well. You know, I think that he. You know, he laid the foundation for us. He built that foundation upon which we could use those agreements to build a better life for our people.
There are still 3 First Nations who remain in negotiations for their agreements: the White River First Nation, the Liard First Nation, and the Ross River Dene Council.
Self-government agreements have empowered communities in ways that are quite remarkable. You now have economic stability in a place like Teslin that before was a seasonal economy with a few other highway maintenance jobs. You now have a fairly substantial civil service there run by the Teslin First Nation that actually is providing stability and foundation for economic development of new houses, you know, the maintenance of the store, all those kinds of things.
We now are one of the probably the biggest landowners in the Yukon Territory. We probably have the biggest bank accounts in the Yukon Territory, and we have connections with the corporate structures in the Yukon and outside of the Yukon as well. And I think on reflection, I think the long ago chiefs would be proud of that fact.
You will not get resource development in the Yukon without First Nation participation and without substantial returns to the First Nations. So they can build their businesses, they can build their companies, they can build their employment, they can build their own prosperity. Look at Victoria Gold and the money it's bringing into sort of central Yukon. You know, huge opportunities for Yukon First Nations people.
Once known as the Council for Yukon Indians, the Council of Yukon First Nations has evolved. The organization is now supporting communities and families, helping build capacity for places like Ross River, which hasn't signed an agreement yet.
We're supporting families, we're supporting communities, we're helping build capacity in places like Ross River that doesn't have an agreement, that needs support, and you know, the federal government ain't responding. You know, I go to Ross River because that's a place where we've invested a lot of our time and energy, let alone resources, to help support those people. And it's something that, regardless of where you come from, regardless of who you are, you know, we've had that mantra here that we need to help our people, especially the next generation.
From a major airline company to large construction companies and joint venture partnerships, across many sectors, Yukon First Nations are a big part of the Yukon's GDP and are working to become self-sustaining in the future.
There's a lot of money now within First Nation governments and their wholly owned development corporations. Right? Champagne-Ajac has, I believe, we're hedging up to 500 employees across all of. That's just one First Nation. So if you times that by, you know, what Teslin Tlingit Council has done, what Vuntagochin, Kwanlin First Nation, those are like, you know, Tronacochin, slowly building up in the Dawson City area, Nacho-Nayak-Dun. So, you know, the policymakers, when they didn't have to worry about the poor little Indian, you know, living in the swamp, right, 15, 60 years ago, they have to take account for Yukon First Nations who you know, make up almost 24% of the population in the territory and have the fastest growing population in the territory. You know, have a lot more say than they did back then. Some of that's attributed to the economic might that we now garner through our land claim and our self-government.
Yukon First Nations should be proud of their achievements. As a member of the Champagne-Ajac First Nations, I know I am. It was a visionary document 50 years ago that brought Yukon First Nations to where they are today. First Nations have always known the Yukon as their home, and now the foundation for their children is assured. For CBC Yukon, I'm Mike Rudyk.